Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenmara.com. Had a hair. A small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and tonight I would like to introduce you to someone who's almost unknown in modern day Wicca, and part of the reason is she was very private, but we'll get into that in a moment. Tonight is our ongoing series of Occult'n'Crochet, where I kind of show off or discuss a new crochet project or a current project, and then we'll go into a historical figure from spirituality or the occult. This is, as far as the crochet part goes, this is the shawl I've been working on. Due to that annoying thing called the day job, I haven't had a lot of time to work on it, but I've added a little bit more space on it, not too much there. And this one is done in a wool blended yarn, so it's going to be fairly heavy duty. It's not going to be super big. It'll be, like I said, the scarf shawl type thing. But that's what I'm working on. I'm hoping to have that finished in the next little while, but like I said, day job and, you know, the normal mundane life. I'd much rather be in the spiritual and artistic, but can't always stay where we would like to sometimes. So back to the spiritual side. Eleanor Bone, and I'll probably end up saying Eleanor just because I know some Eleanors over the years. That's annoying. So she is one of the founders, so to speak. Not founder, so not like a Gerald Gardner founder, but she's one that helped support and bring forward the Wicca practice. This is, I'm almost done with the modern day Wiccan leaders. There's a lot of those who are still alive today that I may reference their work or something like that in future videos. But as far as the Wicca line and the foundation of what we have today, I have a handful of people that I want to touch on, and then we will move on to some other information as well. But this one has been kind of fun because it's getting back to kind of my roots, some of my introduction into the spiritual community. So I just want to make sure that there's a fairly good base of knowledge if you choose to take the steps to go into this. Some of the people we've talked about so far have been a little bit eccentric. Okay, a lot eccentric. But there's a reason for what they did and how they came to be, and that's kind of what I'm trying to bring out is they're just normal people who happen to have taken a spiritual journey. Not everyone is going to be an Aleister Crowley or a Gerald Gardner traveling the world learning from all different types, but those kind of people can bring information and inspire those who choose to take the alternative path. So, where was I? I have notes all over the place here. Today I do want to introduce you to Eleanor Bone. Eleanor Ray Bone was born Eleanor Margaret Tilley, which I'm not sure which is the better name. Honestly, I think for her history, I think the Bone is a better name just because it's an awesome name. But she was born in December of 1911. Because of some people who have elaborated, embellished, and tried to puff up what she did and who she was, I'm going to go with the most agreed upon story. There are several different options as far as where she was, what she did, all of that fun jazz. But for the purposes of what I want to do here, I'm going to stick to... My phone just went off. Just 1 second. Let me mute this. You may not have heard it. I did. So that's the annoying part. Alright. I'm going to try to stick to kind of the middle of the path here, which is when you start getting into some of these people, that's the only thing you can do is take the extremes from both sides, bring it to a center point, and be like, this is the most logical life. So that's what we're going to do with Eleanor today. And No matter what else is going on, I'm going to refer to her as Eleanor primarily. She came into the world in Fleet, Hampshire. Her nickname growing up was Ray, and that name kind of stuck with her for the rest of her life. Again, I will go by Eleanor, but a lot of people knew her by Ray. And it was interesting because it started off as kind of a cute family nickname and then just became part of who she was as she got older. Eleanor's mother was named Emma Tilley, and she was a schoolmistress for the young'uns out there. That would be a teacher that generally taught an entire group in a one-room school building. Sometimes it'd be multiple grades, sometimes it'd just be one teacher teaching that entire grade, but the old names were a little bit more interesting. Eleanor's father was named Charlie Tilley. He worked as a secretary of a golf club in her childhood. There is some information that says her father may have been in the army, a colonel, according to her. From the people who've done a lot more digging than I did and could find, others say that the only name associated with Charlie Tilley was a private in the British Army. So, again, like I said, there's been some embellishments over the years. Not much is known about Eleanor's early life. The parental information, most of what I found anyway, was from a memorial page and then an interview that was done and then a biography that was a kind of the fill-in from that interview after she had passed away. And that was kind of it. And there's not a lot about her growing up, period. She did talk a little bit about it in some of her interviews, but it was pretty vague even there. And I'll go into why she was, well, not why, but I'll go into a little bit of the privacy thing later. But for the most part, there just wasn't a lot of information there. The memorial website did offer some insight into her youth. It was said that she became interested in alternative religions around the age of 8-ish, which I'm not exactly sure how you get that broad of an interest that young, but it was alluded that when her pet cat had passed away, she went to the local church vicar, and the vicar told her, "Pets don't go to heaven, they don't have a soul." This really didn't set well with Eleanor. There was also some stories about her always being able to communicate, sometimes telepathically, sometimes verbally, with animals and the spirit world from birth, basically, is what some of these more far-fetched stories said. In which case, she would have been classified as a birthed witch. Not very common even today. A lot of intuitives and psychics are born with gifts like that. But, again, whether these are embellishments or actualities, that's up for anyone else to decide. I'm just here to introduce you to the person. Eleanor would become a mother to 2 children, John and Francesca. The father's name was Jacob Posner. There is mixed information as to whether they were legally married or not. There's one source I found that said there was an actual legal document saying that they were married, but the majority information just referenced her as her first husband and mother of children, or father of children. It didn't specify full marriage or not. Again, early 1900s, marriages were not as well documented as they are today. They were documented, but at times, it would appear, though, that she would possibly be married multiple times, or at least take on different names over the years. The other part that I thought was interesting is it was very unclear as to what happened to Jacob, the father of her 2 children. So that's kind of where we leave him with the Eleanor thing, is that he helped father her 2 children, and then question mark. During the London Blitz in the Second World War II, Eleanor ended up in Cumbria, not sure how to I look these things up, I listen to them, and then I hop on here and my brain's like, no. but she ended up there to avoid the bombings that were going on during the Blitz. It was there that she would meet a couple, and there was never a name associated that I could find, and I went through a pile of websites trying to find out any information about these people. But they would introduce her to the ancient practice of traditional Wicca. Now, this is in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s. Well, it's the Second World War, so it'd have to be the 40s. Excuse me. Too many long nights, too many early mornings. You know, that day job thing. But this is where she would start to really get involved in traditional witchcraft. And at that time, it wasn't called Wicca. It was literally the craft of the wise. So that's where she was at. After the war, though, Eleanor's story would go cold for a few years, except she would stay with the couple after the Blitz for around 4 years, 3 to 4 years, sources vary, and they would really introduce her, teach her, and educate her on the craft of the wise. This also was the time where she would start to gain a reputation amongst the locals around her area as someone who was exceptionally powerful in her spells, and her knowledge and her guidance were very intuitive and helpful. So this was a very good time for Eleanor. After the war, though, this was where she would meet the man who would give her her last name of Bone. Eleanor would marry William Bill Bone in July of 1958. What I found interesting, or you could say surprising to me, it was a little bit of like one of those, are you kidding? And I double checked this multiple places because this was a huge age gap. Bill was 16 years younger than Eleanor at this time. Usually the man in a lot of these is the older one. He's always hunting, you know, the new young thing. But in this instance, it's quite the opposite. She was actually the significantly older one when they were together, when they got together. And when you do the math, that would put him only a few years, maybe 10 years older than her oldest kid. So, yeah. And during this time, where was I at? Eleanor was the matron, or the mistress, of the Brackenburn Rest Home in Tooting Bec, London. It's basically a retirement home. I grew up calling them something else, but we won't use that term. It's probably not acceptable, so we'll just use the term retirement home. And this was... Oops, where'd it go? There it is. This is probably what most people would have seen at that time. A very matronly woman, very professional, has her stuff together. A little bit of nursing, but a lot of administration. She was kind of the overseer of this whole particular retirement community. Bill, on the other hand, he was what was referenced as an engineer's instrument maker. So I had to look that one up because I'm not really sure what that meant. And the closest thing I can come to is he helped assemble instruments. Some of the older terms referenced musical specifically. Others referenced medical. It could apply to technology. The definition was varied and vague, but basically he was an engineer that put things together. And considering where she was working at the retirement home, I'm going to go with the more medical version because that would make more sense as to how they would have met. Once they were married, though, Bill would have moved into Eleanor's home on Trinity Road. Her home was close to the rest home. Some people say it was a walking distance. Others say it was a short bus ride. Again, sources from the time are a little interesting. It was a nice thing, actually, of Bill to do, so she would only have a short travel. But with not knowing more about his employment, it could have been convenient for him as well if he happened to work close. And since she was kind of the older one. She probably was a bit more established. That was the other reason it made a lot more sense for him to move in with her, because she was already kind of set up. And it was said throughout her life she'd purchased a couple of properties over time. It wasn't all at one time. And she'd buy and sell and move as she needed. Money wasn't a big thing as long as she could pay the bills and enjoy a vacation once or twice a year, is basically the impression that I got about her life. Finances, being wealth and famous and all that, never played into her life, and as we go through, you'll see how that plays out. And I'm telling you, Synergy's kombucha, if you like kombucha, is, I think, probably the best on the market. It's not a not a sponsor or anything, but definitely good stuff. It was shortly after getting married that Eleanor would meet, come into contact with, run across, somehow connect with Gerald Gardner. This is where she really comes into the mainstream, so to speak. There is some speculation about the time frame. It could have been sometime in mid to late 1959. Other sources say it was the early half of the year 1960. Either way, she would write back and forth with Gardner for a little bit, and he would put her into contact with his Bricket Wood Coven. She did not fit in here. Mind you, at this point, she's, in her 40s-ish. The coven at that time, and this was one that Gardner had started, but, over time, people move in and out, hive off, carry on, and this particular coven during this time period was filled with early 20-somethings exploring politics and free love and amorous interests. Eleanor was the mistress/manager of a rest home, a retirement home. She didn't fit with that crowd at all. Her politics weren't in line with the coven. They were all over the place. She was a very traditional woman. She had traditional beliefs. She didn't believe in all of that free love, amorous, etc. And the other thing that I found really entertaining was the phrasing of this last part. She spoke in proper accent, which means she had been properly trained, and by her tone and voice alone, she would have been set apart. As the impression that I got from reading this particular section of this article was that she would have been considered uppity because of how she spoke. And if you've ever watched that old movie, My Fair Lady, you go from the really crass Cockney-style accent to be very delicate and proper. The way a person speaks can 100% separate them from the crowd. And that was the impression I got as I was reading through this section of this particular article, is that the way she spoke, because it was in a proper accent, it was upper class, it was very genteel, it wasn't the more generic language of the time, and so these were things that just really rubbed her and the coven against each other. They did not really like that. Interestingly enough, though, the high priest, and I think it's because he saw in her something special, he would lean on the high priestess of the Bricket Wood Coven and eventually convince the high priestess to initiate Eleanor in the first degree. From what I could find, this was an exceptionally private event. Very few of the coven members were present. It was more like, you know what, Gardner wants this, let's just do this, let's do it quietly, not make a big scene out of it, we're only going to initiate first degree. After that, they were like, we did our part, Gardner, she's yours. So she did eventually connect back in with Gardner, and he would continue her training. He would take her into the second and third degree under his personal tutelage, and over time they would stay in contact until the end of his life. It was at this time, though, that she would take the coven name of Artemis, which I thought was a cool name just in general. She learned quickly, and within a year and a half, so this would put us about 1961, Gardner gave her his blessing, and she would start her own first coven in 1961. When you start to look at some of the progression of steps, the knowledge, and the abilities that were required in proper covens to prove that you understood the information, could wield the forces that you were dealing with, and be able to deal with the authority, this was an exceptionally quick path that she took. There are people who will still today preen about, I'm a fill-in-the-blank level priestess or whatever, but they have nothing to back them up, because they are hunting titles, not understanding the spiritual connection. That's something that Eleanor kind of was separate from the rest of them. She would take the titles because it allowed her to expand her group, expand her knowledge, spread the word, so to speak. But that was not her sole purpose. I mean, Alex Sanders did it, and look at, he was like, how big can we grow this stuff? There's a few other ones that really pomp and circumstanced with their titles. For her, it was a means to an end. It wasn't the end in itself. Eleanor would lead her coven, multiple covens, for over 20 years. She would be the proper face of her coven, with many appearances in magazines, newspapers of the time. The reason that she would even do an interview, the reason that she even allowed people to witness and watch rituals, was to bring a more proper, solemn, dignified aspect to the spiritual practice of Wicca. And in this one area in particular, she sets herself apart from the Gardenian and Alexandrian lines. Not to say that they weren't dignified, but even though she hived off of Gerald Gardner's original group, she was doing it with a reverence that, from the public appearances of the other guys, this is a little bit different, is how she approached and presented Wicca. Her dignified aura left quite the impact on the people who interviewed her and the people who were able to come and witness her rituals in person. This would help solidify the craft as a viable spiritual option. She took what they did, which was great and powerful on its own, but she took it to a different level. And like I said, as I was researching her over the last little while, I've heard of her. I mean, she's bounced around in different things I've read, but it was mainly just kind of in passing. The more I researched her, the more I came to understand and honestly respect it. I'm a traditionalist. I love things that are traditional. I like looking at things, how they were done in the old times, bringing it forward. That's what she did in her life. She took the old, brought the reverence and the mystery and the mystique and the power back, and then taught that. So she had some very interesting views, which were, to me, very awesome. I use the word interesting a lot. I'm sorry. And in all honesty, each of the people I've talked about so far have helped bring the craft forward. They showed it in various ways. They anchored it into our psyche as a people on this planet, and they helped reveal some of this information to the mainstream. But the way she would do it was significantly different than the others. And again, they've all done their different ways. I'm not saying good, bad, or endeavor otherwise, but I vibrate because of my traditional beliefs with the way Eleanor presented it. Over the years, Eleanor would train many other priests and priestesses and help them form their own covens. So she took what she did and helped others hive off from her original covens. Interesting to mention this. There are two primary covens that are mentioned a lot. They are talked about a lot. And that is the Whitecroft Way Coven and the Brighton Coven. These two are the primary covens that reference the root of Gardenian covens in Europe. Gerald Gardner had his couple of covens, but a lot of them tie back to the two that Eleanor started. She was one of the most prominent yet secretive leaders of Wicca in that time. Over the years, though, towards the end of the late 1970s, Eleanor had had enough of the constant working life, and she retired. Her and Bill would move to Alston to run a retirement home. There are some references that say that she purchased this retirement community and ran it herself, and this is kind of where the story falls apart for her, unfortunately. From here on out, not the greatest stuff that happens. The retirement home, due to some form of financial mismanagement, there's not really a clear area what was said or who did what or how it ran. Basically, it ended up closing. At its peak, it had 7,000 people living there. At the time of it closing, there was about 1,200. Bill and Eleanor, at this point, basically were, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. And like I said, I don't know exactly how she tied into this particular situation. If they funded it, they purchased it, bought into shares, however, but she did play a role in the management and the running of it. And when this occurred, they ended up having to sell their property, their house, all that stuff, and they moved into a council home in the area of, I'm going to mess this up, Garrigill or Garrigill. And a council house, if you've never heard of that term, is low rent housing. Generally, it's what the government will give you if you have nowhere else to live in Britain. Even though Eleanor and Bill stayed married, they became very distant from each other. They didn't divorce, but for all intents and purposes, they were separated. They just lived in the same house. Bill would pass away in 1984. Remember, she was 16 years older than him, so that was a very young death for him. Bill would be cremated, and Eleanor would bury him in the cemetery near Garrigill in August of that same year. She officiated the ceremony herself, and the council of the area was not happy about any of it, and they did not approve of what she did. So there's no official record of where he was laid to rest. He was cremated, so it's just ashes. And to this day, from what I could find, his exact place of burial resides only in Eleanor's mind. So that's kind of like I said, things go sad from here on out for her. After Bill passed, Eleanor would form another coven. This group would go on for an additional 10 or so years, and her son from her first marriage, John, would visit her quite frequently. It was said that he was a very frequent visitor and knew the coven very well, all of, that work. But unfortunately, he would pass as well in 1999. Eleanor would cremate her son, and she kept his ashes with her. So at this point, she's kind of by herself family-wise. Not much is said about Francesca, so who knows if she was even still alive at this point, but John was very dear to her and did what he could to take care of her and support her until his passing. After Eleanor's son passed, the coven that she had started in Garrigill slowly disbanded. People moved away. This wasn't a community that was for the young and vibrant, so to speak, so people moved in and out a lot, and so eventually they all moved away, and this left her feeling very lonely. And if that part wasn't bad enough, if we're not being depressing enough here, the Wiccan community that she had spent so many years teaching, training, educating, supporting, spreading the word about, really didn't communicate with her. She had some interviews. I did find some information about interviews that she did later in life between 95 and her passing. But there wasn't a lot. And the primary focus of the community, they just kind of, oh, she's that old traditionalist type of a thing. Not to say it was disrespectful, but it wasn't the connection that it used to be for her. There was one person who kept in touch with Eleanor through this time, and that was another elderly lady from the same council establishment. This lady, never named that I could find, and Eleanor would do crossword puzzles in the afternoon. And they would read crime novels and exchange them back and forth. One would go to the library and the other one would bring them home, and, you know, all that fun stuff, which at least she had some connections. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. And it was said that at this time there were some of the other women in the community, some of the council women and some of the people in the village, if from the council houses, would come and bring her food, sometimes for both of the older ladies, sometimes just for Eleanor. But the only other person really who helped her at this time, or had any real connection with her, was the council building inspector, kind of like the manager of the council houses. And he was kind of became a friend over time, and this inspector would do Eleanor's shopping for her, generally on Thursdays from the reports that I found, and it wasn't a lot. It was like, I need some, need the necessities type of a thing. And so he would go and run her errands for her. And that's kind of the size of her connection at this point. There wasn't a lot there. Just before Mabon, the autumn equinox in 2001, Eleanor had her last interview. And it was a phone interview with a reporter from Britain. And just after this last interview, Eleanor would take sick. When she became sick, she had a single caretaker who would check in on her, stay with her through the day, and this caretaker would show up September 21st, the autumn equinox, to check on Eleanor, and it was on this date that she would leave this world in her sleep. She would pass without a penny to her name. She was in a council house, after all. And they would end up selling everything that she owned. Wasn't much, but they sold it all to pay for her final expenses. This is the part to me that is kind of the worst part of all of this. She didn't do a lot of traveling. She wasn't as extravagant as Gardner or Alex Sanders or even Patricia Crowther. She didn't do as much traveling as that. She didn't have this glamorous lights and spotlight. She would say when she was interviewed, because people would come to her, she didn't usually seek it out. So to me, this was just like the quiet end, not the greatest end, but the quiet end to a very private life. She would be buried with the ashes of her son John. Respectable. It was said that they were interred in an unmarked, and some sources said unconsecrated, grave at the very back of the cemetery, and other sources say the unconsecrated part is outside the cemetery at Garrigill. Local rumors said that the community, the city council, basically, didn't want a witch being buried where people could find her. How scandalous. This was in 2001, mind you. The witch laws were over by this point, so this was some very rude stuff. I have other words, we'll keep those to myself. It was rumors, but there was a lot of information that I was finding that was pointing to they literally did not want anyone knowing where she was buried because they didn't want a witch in their community. It's not like she's going to come back from the grave and curse. Well, she might. You never know. It was a very sad ending for a life for a woman who today would be seen as one of the most influential. And According to the lore, one of the most powerful Wiccan leaders of modern times. Eleanor would leave a great legacy as an exceptionally powerful witch, even though she preferred to work behind the scenes. The public setting was not for her. And this was her during her prime. And if you look right above where my finger is, you'll see that she looks like she's holding something in her hand. Yet there's a sword that goes from her where her hand is to up here. That is a significant piece of metal, and she's holding it up with one arm. Like, that's a lot of weight. But that was the woman that these people were so scared of. She was leading a ritual in this picture. And this is to me just strange, considering most Wiccans, especially during this time, were all about keeping journals and books of shadow and all, keeping track of everything and writing it all down. Eleanor did not leave written records. She taught by oral transmission. She taught through words. Other people wrote stuff down, but for the most part, she did not. Unlike a lot of people in the beginnings of Wicca, she did not leave a book of shadows. She did not leave journals. What was said about her and what I have talked about here, this is from people's memories, public records, and the random interview that I could find today. There were some pictures that I found, and because of the association with news publications, I'm not sharing those. But she actually allowed a reporter and a photographer to be present during initiations in most of the original covens were done exclusively sky-clad. Unlike Gerald Gardner, who did everything sky-clad, initiations were sky-clad. Other rituals, you could wear ritual clothing. Certain robes, dresses, things like that, they were set aside for this purpose. But she kept her life very private. And as I said at the beginning, there's a lot about her that is unknown because she did not want everyone to be pomp and circumstance. Oh, look, we have she didn't want any of that. She wanted to spread Wicca, the blessings of the Lord and Lady. She did not want to have a spotlight put on her. Eleanor, it was said, used traditional witchcraft that she was taught in the 1941-ish era, but also initiated by Gardner and his coven in the late 50s, early 60s. She showed a command of magic, herb lore, the elements, and to a certain extent the Hermetic and Kabbalistic traditions as well. There was one source that I found that actually stated that she had studied Aleister Crowley's work for a couple of years in that quiet period, but that was just one source, so you can take that with a grain of salt if you want. From what I could find of the people who were trained under her, it would not surprise me in the slightest if she incorporated ceremonial magic into her tradition, just from what I've read. Eleanor Bone would not be long forgotten, though, thankfully. Eventually, the Eleanor Bone Memorial Fund was established to recognize her contributions and hard work to the spiritual communities, primarily Wicca. This fund would raise over £2,700. In current dollars, it's about 3,355 American dollars, give or take a penny or two, and a headstone was funded. The headstone was picked out by John's daughter, Eleanor's granddaughter. The fund paid for the headstone, paid to have her, because they knew where she was. The council had record of that. Didn't want to talk about it though. But this fund paid for the tombstone. They paid for all the upkeep. They paid for the maintenance of the area. And They are the reason that we even have anything to say about Eleanor. This is an image that I found, and I clipped it out of a bigger picture, of the ritual that consecrated the gravestone. It has Eleanor's name. It has Arthur William Bone. Everyone called him Bill Bone. That was her husband. And then underneath is John Posney, her son. She was buried with her son John. No one knows where Arthur's body is laid, but they made sure to memorialize him on her headstone. And she is one of two, I believe it was said, people in this particular area or in this part of England that has a pentagram on their tombstone. Most everyone else has crosses or they don't have a symbol at all. She actually is able to have a pentacle, which is a symbol of Wicca and witchcraft, placed on her tombstone. And this is a sign of respect in a lot of ways to the fact that she was able to, in her own quiet way, influence a lot of the Wiccan movement today. She didn't have the thousands of people that Alex Sanders did. She didn't have the bombastic, very out in the open, very public persona that Gerald Gardner espoused. But thanks to her, Patricia Crothers, and another high priestess that we'll discuss later, we now have the tradition of Gardnerian witchcraft that has been brought forward. We have a tradition steeped in earth, the ancient beliefs, and influencing a lot more than people realize today. It's not all pomp and circumstance. By her quiet life and the fact that she was such a powerful figure within that community during her prime, even being someone who's quiet, someone who's let her no be no, her yes be yes, and stood for what she believed, that says a lot. And people sought her out for interviews. People sought her out for conversations. The one thing that I ran across, and I'll wrap this up here, that I thought was kind of funny, her and Patricia Crowther came together, and this was one of the few times that Eleanor stepped forward into the spotlight. And it was, it was to condemn Alex Sanders' claim to a lineage. It was questionable, and I talked about that with Alex, that some of the stuff that he learned before he met Gardner and was initiated, there's some shady information, there's some embellishments that may have occurred, and Eleanor and Patricia were like, dude, no, that's not how this works. This is what we're dealing with. This is what it is. Again, she was a traditionalist, so Alex being a bit more loud about things didn't set well with her. But that is the only reference that I could find where she purposely sought out the spotlight, and it was not so much a condemnation but a reprimand to Alex, like, enough. But after that, she went back into the background, and she would become known as the Matriarch of modern Wicca. I couldn't find an exact source when they started calling her that, but she held that title to this day, really. But she picked that title up in the early mid 70s, and it just kind of carried forward when they'd reference her. It was the Matriarch. So with that, I will let you guys go. If you're new to the channel, please please hit that subscribe button. I can't talk. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this content. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below if you've ever heard of Eleanor Bone, if this is someone that you may have known somebody who knew somebody, or if you've ever seen her memorial in person, because that would be pretty cool too. Other than that, I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you later.